Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going way back to before November 22nd, 1963.
Right, before the assassination of President Kennedy. We're talking about the life of Lee Harvey Oswald, but way before that fateful day in Dallas.
Exactly. Forget the grassy knoll and all those other theories floating around.
We're going deeper, exploring some really intriguing theories about Oswald.
This is all based on a 1987 article from the Third Decade Journal called Double Agent Unmasked, a Reconstruction.
It really is like piecing together a puzzle.
But instead of cardboard pieces, we're dealing with actions, motivations, and a whole lot of mystery.
It's a fascinating perspective shift. I mean, we're not just looking at Oswald as the alleged assassin,
Right.
but exploring this idea that he might have been a pawn in a much larger game.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning with Oswald's early life. And right away, there are some head-scratching contradictions.
Contradictions.
Yeah, like on one hand, he joins the Young People's Socialist League,
Right.
but then he's totally obsessed with the Marines. Strange mix, wouldn't you say?
It certainly raises questions. Was he genuinely drawn to both ideologies, or was this, I don't know, some kind of deliberate attempt to create this confusing profile?
So you're thinking that maybe if he was being groomed for some role, let's say in intelligence, as this article suggests, maybe this seemingly contradictory behavior was all part of a plan.
It's a possibility. Think about it. A young man, socialist leanings, but also serves in the Marines. It's a profile that doesn't really fit into a neat box.
Right.
And that kind of ambiguity, well, it can be pretty useful if you're trying to create a scapegoat.
Someone whose actions can be easily misinterpreted.
Exactly.
Wow, it's mind-boggling to think that someone might intentionally craft such a confusing persona.
It's definitely something to think about.
Let's move on to his time in the Marines.
Yeah.
The article mentions that he was trained in radar technology and stationed at these locations with, pretty high security clearance.
And this detail is crucial because at this exact same time, the Office of Naval Intelligence, the ONI, was running this very secret program. Yeah, they were actively seeking ex-Marines, guys with specific skills, and backgrounds to potentially infiltrate the Soviet Union.
Hold on. You're saying they were training ex-Marines to be spies?
Yeah, essentially. During the Cold War, tensions were through the roof. Both sides were engaged in these all sorts of clandestine operations.
Makes sense.
The ONI thought former Marines with their training and discipline would be ideal for this kind of work.
I see. So Oswald, with his, socialist leanings and language skills, he would have been a prime candidate for this program.
Absolutely, a prime candidate. And then we have this defection of his to the Soviet Union in 1959.
Right.
Now, if we look at this through the lens of, say, this whole patsy theory, it gets way more interesting.
How so?
Was it a genuine act of, disillusionment? Or was it a carefully orchestrated move as part of this much larger intelligence operation?
So are you suggesting that his defection might have been staged?
Well, it's a possibility the article explores. Consider this. He gets a hardship discharge from the Marines just before his official release date. Then he travels to Finland, applies for a Soviet visa, and boom, he's in Moscow.
That does seem awfully convenient, doesn't it?
Very convenient. And then there's the fact that he was allowed to return to the U.S. with his Russian wife and child, with surprising ease, I might add.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
If it was a real defection, you'd think his return would have been much more difficult.
Yeah, much more difficult, if not impossible. His smooth re-entry really raises serious questions about what he was really doing in the Soviet Union.
Right.
Was he truly a defector who just changed his mind? Or was he playing a role all along?
Well, the article doesn't give us any concrete answers about what he was actually doing in the Soviet Union.
No.
There are theories, though. Some say he was spying on economic institutions or even involved in gathering intelligence on the U-2 spy plane program.
Right. There are a lot of theories. But, the key takeaway here really is that his experience in the Soviet Union, whether genuine or staged, it adds another layer to this already complex profile.
Okay.
And this becomes even more important as we follow his movements back here in the United States. So Oswald's return to the U.S. in 1962, that's a real turning point, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. He's not just this, former Marine with a curious past anymore. He's now on the radar of U.S. intelligence, especially the FBI.
Right. Exactly. And this is where, if we're looking at this whole patsy idea, things get really interesting.
How so?
Well, if the article's right, Oswald's activities when he gets back to the U.S., they weren't just some confused ex-defector trying to figure things out. It was like orchestrated moves in this big, shadowy game.
I see, like he was being played.
Yeah, think about it. It's the peak of the Cold War, right?
Yeah.
Tensions are super high, especially with the whole Cuban Missile Crisis thing going on. And then you've got this guy, Oswald, with his background, his Soviet experience. He becomes, well, a valuable asset.
Right.
Someone who could be used.
The article mentions he was interviewed by the FBI right after he got back. But here's the strange part. The agent said he was hostile and uncooperative. That doesn't sound like someone they'd want to recruit.
Well, that could all be a cover story, you know? Protect his identity if he was an informant. Remember, the Cold War was all about deception. Making him look difficult could have been a way to throw people off.
Right, so what was Oswald actually doing for the FBI? The article says something about undercover operations.
He was, and these operations, they really add to this whole patsy theory, if you think about it. For example, he was helping a state investigating committee. They were looking into these illegal gun sales.
So he was undercover, buying guns. But if he was working for the FBI, why would they have him doing that? I mean, wouldn't that connect him to illegal activity?
Well, that's kind of the point, isn't it? The article's saying that maybe by having Oswald involved in these operations, those in control were leaving a trail deliberately. It's like they were planting evidence before anything even happened.
It's chilling to think about. They also mention Oswald was using this alias, A.J. Hadel, to order guns through the mail, like a pistol, a rifle, that sort of thing.
Right, and back then, gun control wasn't what it is today. So by having him order these weapons with a fake name, they're linking him to the kind of weapon that would later be used in the assassination.
So he's basically building a case against himself without even knowing it.
Yeah, that's the idea. But it didn't stop there. His work with the FBI went deeper. They had him infiltrate these anti-Castro groups.
Okay.
And you gotta remember, this is happening when things are really tense between the U.S. and Cuba. The Kennedy administration, they're trying to cool things down, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Part of that means cracking down on anti-Castro groups here in the U.S. The FBI, well, they were tasked with getting inside these groups, finding out what they were up to.
Oh, I see.
So they send in Oswald, a guy who publicly defected to the Soviet Union, who's known for his, socialist leanings.
It's almost like they were setting him up to take the fall. Like they knew something was going to happen.
And that's what the article is getting at. The author argues that Oswald, with his background, his public image as a pro-Castro radical, he was being groomed to be the perfect scapegoat. Someone who, if they needed to, could be easily framed as the guy who would take out the president.
And one of the people he was targeting was this General Edwin Walker, a retired Army general, right? A very outspoken anti-communist.
Right, exactly. And to get close to Walker's group, Oswald had to really play up his Marxist side, reading Russian publications, talking about Castro, all while feeding info back to the FBI.
It's like he was living a double life. Actually, more than double.
It was a dangerous game. And it gets even more complicated when we follow Oswald to New Orleans. Yeah. April 1963.
New Orleans. Okay, things are about to get interesting. What happens there?
That's where things escalate. New Orleans, it's like this whole other level of intrigue. And Oswald, well, he's caught in the middle of all of it.
So we left off with Oswald in New Orleans. 1963. Deep undercover, playing this double game. Publicly pro-Castro, but working for the FBI. I mean, talk about a recipe for disaster.
Oh, yeah, definitely a high-wire act. And according to this article, things get even, more manipulative in New Orleans, almost like whoever's pulling the strings is getting bolder. Like they're more sure they can control Oswald.
And this whole theory that he was being set up as a patsy, it really comes into focus here.
Yes.
It claims he was being put into situations where, he'd look suspicious, like he was this dangerous radical who was, capable of violence.
Right, like they were building a case against him before anything even happened. And remember, he's still working with the FBI on those illegal gun-running operations down there.
Right.
And at the same time, he's supposed to infiltrate the anti-Castro exile groups. These were groups known for their extreme views and their willingness to use force.
The article mentions two names specifically. Guy Bannister, an ex-FBI agent who had a private detective agency, and William Riley, some businessman with strong anti-Castro connections.
Both of them were deep into covert operations against Castro, and they believed Oswald's act, this whole pro-Castro thing, was real, so they hired him, thinking he could give them the inside scoop on what the enemy was doing.
So they're basically using him to spy on other anti-Castro groups, never realizing he's already feeding information to the FBI. What a tangled web.
It gets even more tangled, though. We have to talk about Carlos Bringway. He was the leader of the New Orleans branch of the Directorate Revolucionario Estudiantil, or DRE.
Right, the DRE.
Yeah.
This group was, well, they were considered the most radical anti-Castro group, even more extreme than the others.
Yeah, the enfant terrible of the exile community, known for their willingness to resort to violence.
Exactly. And if you remember, Oswald's cover had already been blown by some of Walker's people back in Dallas. So Bringuier was suspicious of Oswald from the beginning. He quickly confirmed his suspicions through his contacts, too.
So Oswald is in a tight spot now, working for the FBI, trying to infiltrate this really dangerous group, all while knowing at least one anti-Castro group is onto him.
What happens next?
Well, this is where the article gets really, really interesting. It suggests that Oswald might have become more than just an informant, like he was being deliberately set up to take the fall for Kennedy's assassination.
Hold on. Are you saying there were people, maybe within the anti-Castro movement, who were planning to kill Kennedy and make it look like Castro did it?
It sounds crazy, I know, but think about it. These groups, they were desperate to see Castro gone. They saw Kennedy's attempts to, to talk with the Soviets as a betrayal. They wanted action, and they might have seen this as a way to force the U.S. into a conflict with Cuba.
And Oswald, with his background, his image as this, pro-Castro radical, he'd be the perfect fall guy. Kill Kennedy, make sure Oswald's connected to it, and then boom, use that to justify an invasion of Cuba.
That's the idea the article's putting forward. And it goes on to say that from, I think it was mid-August onward, Oswald was being controlled even more tightly. The conspirators, they needed to make sure he didn't expose their plan and that he was, in the right place at the right time.
The article also mentions that Oswald was getting increasingly paranoid around this time. He even left a note with the FBI, warning them about a possible assassination attempt on Kennedy during his visit to Texas. He called the FBI in Washington directly, too.
Right. Bypassing his usual contact, he was definitely trying to warn someone, trying to tell them what he knew. But either those warnings were ignored or, well, someone made sure they were never taken seriously.
So what about the days right before the assassination? Oswald was back in Dallas by then, right? Working at the Texas School Book Depository.
Yeah, he was. But there's this other piece of the puzzle the article introduces, the impersonator Oswald. The author claims there was someone else pretending to be Oswald seen around Dallas at that time, and that this fake Oswald was doing things to make the real Oswald look even more guilty.
So we've got the real Oswald working with the FBI, trying to figure out what's going on, and then we've got this fake Oswald running around creating false evidence.
It's pretty wild, right?
It really is. Okay, let's talk about the day of the assassination, November 22nd, 1963. What does the article say happened?
Well, the author says Oswald's movements that day were orchestrated, that he was given specific instructions to make him look suspicious. For instance, he was told to bring this package to work. It was supposed to have curtain rods in it.
Curtain rods? Why would that matter?
It was all about creating a false impression. The author thinks it was deliberate. They wanted to make it look like Oswald was carrying a rifle. He was even told to, look out the window holding the package. That way someone would see him with something long and narrow,
It's all about planting those seeds of doubt, isn't it? Creating a story that fits their plan.
Exactly. And then there's the question of where Oswald actually was during the assassination. According to this article, he wasn't supposed to be at the Texas School Book Depository at all. He was supposed to be somewhere else along the motorcade route, like an observer.
Okay, so if Oswald wasn't at the depository, who was?
The author thinks it was another one of those impersonators, someone put there to be seen after the shooting, someone who could be easily identified as Oswald, which would make everyone think he was the shooter.
Wow, like they were closing the trap, making every detail fit their story.
Right. And while all this was happening, the real Oswald, following his FBI contact's instructions, was supposed to leave the scene right after the motorcade went by, walk to a bus station, take a taxi, get off at a certain spot where a police car would be waiting to, take him to safety.
Safety? From who?
From the conspirators. The author says that once the assassination happened, Oswald's handlers would have known he was a loose end. They would have suspected he was an informant, and they would have wanted to silence him for good. The plan was to get him out of Dallas before they could get to him.
But that's not how it played out, is it? Oswald was arrested at the Texas Theater, not by a police car, but by the local police after a whole confrontation.
Right, and he never got to say what he knew. Jack Ruby took care of that a couple of days later.
This deep dive, it's been a whirlwind. So many twists and turns, so many shocking things. We've gone from Oswald as the lone gunman to Oswald as the passee, caught in this web of intrigue he might not have even understood.
It's a really complex theory, that's for sure. We can't know for sure if this reconstruction is accurate, but it really makes you think about the official story. It makes you question everything we thought we knew.
It makes you ask, what if Oswald wasn't alone? What if, just like the article says, he was a pawn in this bigger game?
And that's maybe the most disturbing part of this whole story, this idea that someone's life and a whole nation's fate could be used like that.
It's definitely something to think about. And it leaves us with more questions than answers.
That's the thing about searching for the truth, especially when it comes to something as big and as mysterious as the Kennedy assassination. It's rarely simple.
We hope this deep dive has made you question things, think critically, and maybe even do some research on your own. The story of Lee Harvey Oswald and what happened in Dallas on November 22, 1963, continues to fascinate us all. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.